I guess so far I've been to like 80% of the BIP conferences. Hopefully in the limit that approaches 100%. Anyway, so I'm going to give a kind of technical talk, and I'm going to take some liberties to try to make it more understandable while still covering a lot of technical content. We have to go fast because I have a lot of slides. So here's kind of the outline. So I'm going to kind of talk about this like methodological rift in the cryptocurrency space between people who regard it as a distributed systems problem and people who just regard it as an economic problem. And then kind of motivate the idea that we should think about it in economic terms, define cryptoeconomics, show kind of some guidelines for how to do analysis, show some kind of the best methods that we have, some open questions, and then I'll just wrap it up. So let's get started. So there is like a methodological rift in the cryptocurrency community. A lot of people believe, there's like kind of two camps. A lot of people believe that blockchains are primarily a solution to a computer science problem, like a distributed systems problem, like a consensus Byzantine fault tolerance problem. And then there's some of us, fewer, who believe that is fundamentally and primarily a mechanism design problem, a problem of designing incentives, aligning incentives, and dealing with kind of difficult incentive questions. Only applied to distributed systems setting. And this camp kind of applies economics to a distributed system problem. So the order of priorities is different between these camps. So in the first camp, people tend to do Byzantine fault tolerance analysis, and their protocol design basically comes out of this analysis. Basically, they want to design protocols that tolerate Byzantine faults, and then basically they want to show usually like safety and liveness, but liveness is harder to prove, so it's only sometimes done. By relying on some assumption about the number of faults that there are, namely, and the kind of converse of that is the assumption on how many nodes are not faulty. Usually they assume like 50% or 2/3 are honest. In the kind of cryptoeconomic camp, we do economic analysis first, and that's kind of like our mainstay of our analysis, and then we design protocols that somehow have safety and liveness under this economic analysis. Basically, like the simplest thing to say is that like safety and liveness are an equilibrium of the protocol. Equilibrium is this notion in game theory and kind of economics where somehow it's like the stable state that things tend to, where if they end up there, they'll stay there. So the first camp is actually much bigger than the second camp, and there's a couple of reasons for this. One is that they have a lot more to draw about consensus from their literature, right? Like the mechanism design incentive literature says almost nothing about distributed systems or consensus. The distributed systems and consensus literature says a lot about it. And so there's a lot that you can kind of gain from already existing peer-reviewed literature if you're taking this from a distributed systems point of view, whereas like from an economic point of view, you need to really apply basic principles to this new setting. There's kind of this kind of much bigger community of people doing computer science and distributed systems than there are people doing algorithmic game theory and mechanism design, like orders of magnitude bigger. And so somehow just because of that, it's harder to get people to like from the outside the cryptocurrency space into this camp. But like thankfully somehow Bitcoin started us up here and like gave us some hints that this is a thing. And kind of that ties into this motivation section where basically I'm going to say that like Bitcoin is the kind of the foundational example of like cryptoeconomics. It's kind of the thing that like made us pay attention to this field, this idea that we can use incentives to secure distributed systems. So basically, but simple. Bitcoin is a miracle, right? It's shockingly simple in terms of the consensus protocol. I mean, there's no consensus protocol that's as simple as Bitcoin. Like not even Raft, right? And Bitcoin also has a shockingly simple incentive mechanism. Like I've never seen an incentive mechanism as simple as Bitcoin's incentive mechanism, and somehow it works. It's a miracle, and somehow it uses the issuance of tokens and fees to compensate miners for their proof of work, and it uses this proof of work for an anti-Sybil mechanism. What that means more broadly, we're going to start talking about in later sections, right? But basically, there are some economic questions that are relevant to Bitcoin that can't really be understood in terms of fault tolerance. For example, does the security of Bitcoin fall when the price of Bitcoin falls? And the answer is kind of yes. Like if the price of Bitcoin was low enough for long enough, the hash rate would fall because people weren't getting compensated for the work, and the security would fall in the sense that it would be easier for an external adversary to take over the network. Is the Bitcoin protocol a Nash equilibrium of the Bitcoin protocol? Well, it turns out that, no, it isn't. I mean, Gun Sirer and Itai al showed in their selfish mining paper that there are rational deviations from the Bitcoin protocol that improve a miner's performance. And so, Bitcoin is actually in some way not incentive compatible. And somehow these two facts are not captured by Byzantine fault tolerance analysis. Like the safety proof that says, like, look, as long as half the miners are honest, always holds, whether or not the price of Bitcoin goes down, and whether or not, and like somehow the protocol deviation thing, it also kind of holds as long as you assume that those nodes are going to be online forever and keep working. Although, like realistically, if your blocks are being orphaned, you're going to put online fewer miners than anyone else. Or than people who are like selfish mining. So it's kind of clear to me that like incentives are really relevant to Bitcoin. And it's also clear to me that Bitcoin is like a suboptimal solution, and so there's obviously like some work to be done. But even if Bitcoin was optimal, there would still be more work to be done because we want to apply this principle of like using incentives to secure distributed systems to other distributed systems rather than just to Bitcoin, right? Because it's an interesting idea more generally. Like maybe we can incentivize BitTorrent. Maybe we can incentivize other protocols that we rely on in a distributed system setting. And so now I'm going to like give you some idea of what cryptoeconomics might be. These definitions might not be the most formal, but I think they're going to be useful. So, and I've already said this, cryptoeconomics is really the application of incentive mechanism design. Oh, I haven't quite said this, my bad. It's like the application of incentive mechanism design to information security goals, i.e. like the goals of, like cryptography is normally kind of associated with. And the information security problems can be stuff like a protocol guarantee for a distributed system, such that like for example, like a consensus protocol is very much like a security protocol, even though it traditionally hasn't been thought of as purely cryptographic. So we're kind of interested in taking distributed systems, opening their participation to the internet, and incentivizing the participants to behave according to the way that system expects. And opening things up to the internet is kind of notoriously difficult because of the Sybil attack problem, right? Where if you open up to the internet, anyone can make a node that runs in your protocol, and somehow they might be able to overrun your protocol with nodes that they add in. And somehow we can use incentives to prevent or make it prohibitively difficult to conduct these attacks. And once people do run nodes, we can kind of incentivize them to actually follow the protocol and do kind of the thing that we expect in order to get our information security goals. This is I think the best one sentence motivator for why this is interesting. Cryptography is inherently backwards facing. Cryptographic proofs always are a function of information that already exists. Incentives are inherently forward-facing. There's no way that you can be incentivized by a payout you received in the past, right? It's kind of far gone at this point. And so somehow, if you have both of these in your toolkit, you have like both like ability to check the correctness of stuff that's going in the past, and the ability to kind of assert that things will happen in a certain way in the future. And so that's kind of still to this day maybe one of the like most convincing short pitches for cryptoeconomics. Now you might think, okay, well, fault tolerance is also forward-facing, and that's true. And you can talk about like what will happen in the future under a fault tolerance model. However, it's unable to handle some things that cryptoeconomics is able to look at. Like for example, the disincentivization of Byzantine faults, right? So like Byzantine faults kind of are assumed to like have some number, and there's no real question in fault tolerance analysis of like why they're happening. And like how we could discourage them from happening. There's this problem of like individually rationally deciding whether to run a node, right? In an open protocol, everyone has to kind of make this decision, like, do I run a node or not? And that's kind of not captured in Byzantine fault tolerance analysis. And this idea that we need to have like economic barriers to Sybil attacks also is not captured in Byzantine fault tolerance analysis. And these somehow are all very relevant to our setting. And so there are things that we care about that aren't addressed by fault tolerance analysis, but are addressed by cryptoeconomics. So now I'm going to kind of go over a basic tool for cryptoeconomic analysis. Basic. It's pretty sophisticated, but it's not entirely complete. But it's a great start. We call it the Spore analysis framework. Basically, there's a bunch of properties that we kind of look at, like stability, like is actually following the protocol in equilibrium, persistence. If the game somehow falls out of equilibrium, does it come back, right? Like if you push it over, does it recover, or is it just down forever? Optimality, kind of the question of whether or not following the protocol actually does what provide the goals that we have. So somehow, we should be incentivizing a protocol that actually provides the goals that we want to reach. Like robustness. This one's kind of one of my favorite ones. Is the guarantee that come out of the protocol resistant to perturbations in players' incentives? I mean, if you perturb players' incentives, their behaviors might change. And how much do you have to perturb them in order to get enough of them to change in order to undermine the protocol guarantees? And that's kind of this robustness question. Like, how much do you have to push on it to get rid of that equilibrium? And then efficiency is also an interesting question. Like how much are we paying for this economic security, right? And also, what is the kind of computational overhead of this stuff? So basically, these are all interesting for different reasons, and I'm going to go over it quickly. So stability is kind of super interesting because we want to know that somehow individuals or even coalitions don't have an incentive to deviate from the protocol. Because if they do, then we don't know why they would continue to run our protocol in the future, right? Maybe they run a version of BitTorrent that doesn't upload because who needs the liability when you can free ride? So we have this stability is kind of parametric in an equilibrium notion. Most people are probably familiar with Nash equilibrium, which means that every individual has no incentive to deviate given that other people's strategies are fixed. Dominant strategy equilibrium is kind of a little bit stronger, where it says you don't have an incentive to deviate no matter what other players are doing. Strong Nash equilibrium is kind of like a Nash equilibrium, only instead of looking at individual deviations, you look at coalitional deviations. So not only do I deviate alone, I can deviate with any other set of players to some way that benefits each of us. And then coalitional dominant strategy equilibrium is kind of similar thing where not only does a coalition not have an incentive to deviate, but it doesn't have any incentive to deviate no matter what other people are doing. So it's somehow stronger than this. And this is the strongest notion of equilibrium that I've listed here. I would love to talk more about equilibrium theory notions, but I'm going to have to just assume you understand. Persistence basically the question is if we happen to be at this strategy profile over here, will we get back to the equilibrium? Is there a way for people to rationally deviate from any possible strategy profile to the one that the protocol intends? And if so, then we say that it's persistent in that any way that you can push it over, it will recover as soon as you let go of that pressure. And basically it requires that we have a unique equilibrium and that there's always a kind of uphill path for these deviations to that equilibrium. And this kind of thinks about failure modes. How can we recover from failure modes? Is it rational for people to recover from failure modes? Optimality. This is kind of an interesting one. Is the protocol that we're incentivizing actually optimal for solving the problem that we have? Does it provide the stated guarantees? For a consensus protocol, we have to ask, if we're are we safe and live? And hopefully in an asynchronous network with some highest number of Byzantine faults. It's normally understood to be a kind of this is kind of what is optimal for consensus according to traditional consensus literature. So robustness is kind of my favorite one, and you'll see why. Basically, it has to do with, again, the size of the perturbation to the incentives required to kind of break the protocol. And the reason why this is really interesting is because external incentives have to be at least the size of the robustness in order to cause a deviation from the protocol. So basically, we can maximize our security against external incentives by maximizing our internal robustness. Somehow, if I can maximize the amount of perturbations that I can withstand, then I can maximize the amount of external incentives that my protocol will survive. And so somehow we don't need to speculate too much or at all, actually, about the game that people are playing outside the protocol to maximize our security against it. And so that's really neat. Efficiency is another one. How for every bit of robustness, how much are we paying for it, right? In some way, the larger the pay. If we scale the payouts of an incentive mechanism linearly, then we're going to get all of the other analysis all this analysis is still the same, but for every dollar spent, there's a certain amount of robustness that's gained. And so somehow we want to spend as little as possible to get as much security as possible, right? And also an efficiency question is not just in terms of the cost to economically, but also the cost in terms of computational and network overhead. That's a more traditional kind of efficiency question. So now I'm going to go into kind of more exciting stuff. I hope that I'm not losing you. So here's some of the state-of-the-art methodology in cryptoeconomic mechanism design. The first one, this is the kind of the most important takeaway, is fault attribution. Fault attribution is basically some way for the incentive mechanism to tell which strategies were taken by the different players in the network. Normally, in incentive mechanism design, game theory, and mechanism design, like we assume that the mechanism has access to what strategies people take. But on a distributed system, actually, the incentive mechanism only has access to certain messages and needs to infer what happened. And so somehow, the fault attribution, like being able to tell who did what, makes it a lot easier to incentivize a protocol, right? If you can tell who followed the protocol and who didn't, you penalize the one who didn't and you reward the ones who did, and that kind of makes it really easy to have really nice equilibriums. So for example, if we can always tell, if someone deviated from the protocol, like who they might have been, then it's actually really easy to get a robust coalitional dominant strategy equilibrium, because anyone who deviates from the protocol gets penalized. And so this means even if people form a cartel that has 80-90% of the weight, somehow they will be penalized from deviating from the protocol, because the incentive mechanism will be able to kind of infer that they might have been responsible for these faults. There are fundamental limits to fault attribution. And basically because in a distributed system, it's really hard from a process sitting here to know whether an apparent message that failed to get from Alice to Bob was because Alice failed to send it, because Bob pretended not to receive it, or because it's still in transit. Those are kind of indistinguishable from the point of view of this third process that's observing the setting. So somehow, in distributed systems, there are fundamental limits to the attribution of faults, and this is going to be kind of interesting for our context, because we are in a distributed system kind of context. So now security deposits. Security deposits are really great. They're great mechanisms because they're really easy to reason about. You kind of place a deposit, and then there's a rule which, if it's satisfied, then you lose some amount of your deposit. Somehow, it's really simple to reason about the incentives and to program the loss of these deposits. And they also have maximum economic efficiency. This is kind of a claim, basically because if you're going to pay someone X dollars and you want to be able to disincentivize them as much as possible, then the best you can do is kind of to require that they place the biggest deposit they'd be willing to in order to get a return of X, and so that in the worst case they end up losing this kind of X divided by R term, where R is their cost of capital for whatever term that their deposit is on. So somehow, they wouldn't be willing to place more than X over R, because they would rather use their capital somehow else if R is their cost of capital. And so somehow, if you're going to pay them X, the biggest disincentive that you could possibly get is X over R. And so somehow, security deposits are kind of it. And this is just assuming that there is nothing like reputation. So here's a cool thing. If we have perfect fault attribution, we can just say pay everyone who followed the protocol X and take away everyone's deposit if they didn't follow the protocol. And this is somehow optimal in the sense that it's clearly equilibrium and clearly maximally robust. I'm kind of going to speed up a little bit because I don't have much time. So thanks, Roman. But if we know exactly who followed the protocol and who didn't, then we can kind of totally remove all of the money from people who didn't, and give those minimal reward to people who did, and that's kind of the best that could ever be done. And so that's cool, but we kind of have so that's imperfect fault attribution. But of course, I just said that there's fundamental limits to fault attribution, so we're not going to have perfect fault attribution. And instead, there's going to be a trade-off, actually, between increasing robustness and fairness, because if you penalize people more for faults they may not have committed, that's kind of more unfair, but it does penalize the people who did commit those faults more, and that makes it more robust. And so there's a trade-off that we have to make somehow, and there's kind of a debate about how. My favorite way is to kind of define this iterated game, where first you're deciding whether to participate, and then you're playing the game, and then to talk about the robustness of that game, and somehow you can maximize this. You can make this trade-off in order to maximize the robustness. Vitalik prefers to say okay, here's we want to minimize unfairness first and then maximize robustness. This is an interesting kind of space. So getting rid of in-protocol thresholds. This is something that I'm a big fan of. Basically, if you have some nonlinearity in the strategies that are available to a coalition as the coalition grows, somehow that leads to weird dynamics in the game. And for consensus protocols, that might be removing this kind of threshold of 60%. of messages required before making a decision. This can be challenging, but if you can do it, it improves the economic analysis because it kind of makes coalitional deviations a little bit easier to reason about, or makes it so that like adding a node to a coalition always kind of increases your capacity, and there's not like some kind of top where you have an optimal coalition size. So let's talk about some open questions in cryptoeconomics. These are stuff that we kind of don't know. We don't really know that well. I can't say that like we have all the answers. So what if there's more than one optimal protocol for our particular goal? Like liveness in asynchronous networks for consensus protocols. We may want to incentivize the outcome, like liveness, rather than incentivizing adherence to a protocol. But all the stuff that I kind of talked about, the fault attribution, is just about telling whether or not someone adhere to a protocol. So incentivizing people to follow a protocol is somehow easier than incentivizing some outcome where you don't really mind which protocol they use to get there. And so this is kind of an interesting open area with lots of stuff probably to see. Dealing with computational complexity of fault attribution is interesting also. Like sometimes it's going to be very difficult actually to like enumerate all of the possible ways that people could have been faulty in order to lead to this failure. And so we might need to find bounds on fault attribution. So like the fault attribution protocol that I have now, is kind of this brute force thing. It happens to work well for like consensus protocols that I look at, but it may not work well for every protocol. So rational participation in these games without perfect attribution is an interesting thing also, because like somehow you might be treated unfairly and that might make it less likely for you to participate. But like our current models for deciding whether you'll participate are kind of based on like, very simple things like expected returns and distributions of the cost of capital. Whereas like we might say want to take into account behavioral effects, kind of because people are averse to these unfair scenarios. Maybe maybe like, for example, in our current models, we're not even really thinking about risk aversion. We're just kind of doing like an expectation maximization. It would be cool if we had more of that. It's just something that we haven't really done that much yet. That somehow is like lower hanging fruit than some of the other ones. So somehow there are limits to cryptoeconomic design for protocols that aren't objective, where basically somehow there's valid messages that may be correct or not, and there's no way for the protocol to tell, because the protocol says like, hey, look, tell me what temperature it is outside, and somehow the protocol, that's not like a objective thing that the protocol can check by itself. So for example, like what is the limits to the security of Oracle systems is a very good question, and something where it's kind of actually much harder. We can kind of show that if you have a coalitional deviations where you allow anyone, no matter how many nodes, to deviate, that there is going to be a failure mode. Whereas like with the fault attribution stuff, we actually can get stronger results than in this case where somehow faults are less attributable. Here's here we go. And this is kind of the best for last. This is like one of the deepest, most kind of fundamental problems in mechanism design for distributed systems, and also mechanism design more broadly. Like, can we create coordination costs? Well, coordination costs are kind of hard to define, hard to measure, and super hard to engineer. Super hard to guarantee coordination costs. But if we could, then we can solve a whole bunch of problems that we can't solve right now. Like, for example, we could secure multi-party computation in an economic setting because we could say, look, the coordination costs are too high for everyone to combine the secrets. Or maybe these Oracle games, we know that like the coordination costs are too high for them to coordinate for it to be worth it for them to game the system. Or maybe the validator's dilemma, where validators try to coordinate in order to validate as little as possible. So somehow, if we are able to engineer coordination costs, then this opens up a big field of mechanism design possibilities that we don't have access to right now. This is a big open question. Like, is this possible? We don't really know. So, wrapping up, we've kind of been working on this for a few years. We started off like looking only at kind of individual choice game theory, where individually rational deviations, and we kind of moved towards coordinated choice game theory, which we think is kind of more appropriate for our kind of highly concentrated oligopolistic public cryptocurrency markets. And instead of looking at like a kind of bribing attacker that tries to encourage people to independently deviate, we look at the cost to a coalition of conducting an attack. The kind of we kind of used to look only at like economic security and stability. Now we look at a few more things, and so somehow the scope of our interest has broadened, and we're somehow reaching in some places for like fundamental limits and optimal solutions, like for example in the perfect attribution security deposit case. But we still have like interesting open questions, and there's still a lot of work, and there's just, and especially there's kind of we need help, right? Because it's a nascent field of study that addresses kind of issues that we actually face in blockchains, but maybe also in open protocols generally. And it kind of promises to give more robustness, stability than is currently available in if you just use a distributed systems only approach, because of the kind of limitations of that approach to deal with, say, individual rational participation, Sybil attacks, failure of protocol messages. Finally, last slide. We need help doing the research, and we also need help kind of educating and doing documentation to like convince people that cryptoeconomics is a useful thing. So thanks a lot.